fluorescent lights of LAX's Terminal 4 hummed a monotonous, indifferent tune, a sound Eleanor Vance had come to associate with the peculiar limbo of travel. At 71, the retired professor of American history found airports to be living museums of the human condition, all hurry and wait, anxiety and anticipation, contained in a sterile ecosystem of overpriced coffee and rolling luggage. Her focus, however, was not on the grand tapestry of travelers, but on the small, vibrant thread beside her. "See that one, Grandma?" Maya whispered, her finger pressing against the massive window overlooking the tarmac. "That's a 777 300ER. You can tell by the raked wingtips and the size of the GE90 engines. They're the most powerful jet engines in the world." Eleanor smiled, her gaze softening as she looked at her 10-year-old granddaughter. Maya's hair was braided into 2 intricate cornrows that fell past her shoulders, and her dark eyes, so like her mother's, shone with an intelligence that was both fierce and joyful. In her small hands, she clutched a worn copy of a book on aircraft design. "And how, my little aeronautical engineer, do you know all that?" "Mummy taught me," Maya said, her voice dropping a little, the ever-present shadow of grief touching the edge of her enthusiasm. She said flying wasn't magic, it was just brilliant physics. She said understanding it makes it even more beautiful. It had been 2 years since Eleanor's daughter Sarah had been taken from them by a swift and merciless illness. The void she left was vast, a crater in their family. This trip to Seattle was a pilgrimage of sorts, their first time making the journey without her. They were going to see Maya's grandfather, Sarah's father, a man who had retreated even further into his own world since his daughter's passing. Eleanor had planned this trip with the precision of a military campaign. Months ago, she'd booked their tickets on Apex Air, Flight 822. Knowing Maya's fascination, and knowing how much this flight would be a tribute to her mother's memory, Eleanor had paid a significant premium for seats 9A and 9B. A window for Maya, the aisle for herself. Seat 9A was directly over the wing, offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the flaps, slats, and ailerons, the very mechanics of flight that Sarah had so lovingly explained to her daughter. It wasn't just a seat, it was a classroom, a memorial, a connection to a voice they both desperately missed. Boarding for Apex Air, Flight 822 to Seattle, will now begin with our summit tier and first-class passengers. Eleanor gathered their backpacks. Maya's was adorned with patches of various aircraft, while Eleanor's contained her journal, a fountain pen, and a book on the Gilded Age, research for an article she was slowly piecing together in her retirement. They were in boarding group 2. Soon they were walking down the jet bridge, the sterile air of the terminal giving way to the faint, metallic scent of the aircraft's cabin. "Here we are, my love," Eleanor said, guiding Maya down the narrow aisle. "Row 9. Maya's face lit up as if she'd just seen the gates of Disneyland. The window of 9A was her portal. She slid past Eleanor, her small frame settling into the seat with a happy sigh. She buckled her seatbelt with practiced efficiency, and immediately pressed her face to the triple-paned acrylic, her breath creating a small, fleeting cloud. Her quiet commentary began at once, a soft narration of the ground crews ballet, the lumbering fuel truck, the precise dance of the baggage handlers. This was her element. Eleanor smiled, a genuine heart-easing smile. She stowed their bags in the overhead bin and settled into her aisle seat, 9B. She pulled out her journal, intending to jot down a few observations, but found herself simply watching the pure, unadulterated joy radiating from her granddaughter. This was why she had insisted on this trip, to see this light in Maya's eyes again, this peace, this happiness. The peace was not shattered. It was surgically dissected by a voice that was both sharp and syrupy, a weaponized form of politeness. "Oh, excuse me. I think there's been a little mix-up. You're in my son's seat." Eleanor looked up. A woman stood in the aisle, a vision in cream-colored linen that seemed utterly immune to wrinkling. Her blonde hair was styled in a way that suggested it had been insured for a significant sum. Her makeup was a flawless mask of expensive indifference. Beside her, a boy of about 11, clutching a brand-new iPhone, chewed gum with an open-mouthed languor that broadcasted his profound boredom with the universe. Eleanor offered the polite, slightly distant smile she had perfected over decades of dealing with overzealous university department heads. "I don't believe so. We are in seats 9A and 9B. She nodded towards her boarding pass, which she had tucked into the seatback pocket. The woman, whose name Eleanor would soon learn was Tiffany Sterling, did not deign to look. Her gaze flickered over Maya, lingered on the window for a moment, and then settled back on Eleanor with the air of someone explaining a very simple concept to a very slow learner. "Right. But my son Chad always has a window seat. It's for his anxiety," she stated, as if announcing a royal decree. "His father is an Executive Summit member. We booked the entire row for our comfort, but their system must have glitched and released one of the seats. It happens." Chad, the allegedly anxious child, snorted a laugh at a video on his phone, looking about as anxious as a basking lizard. "I'm sure you did book a window seat," Eleanor replied, her voice maintaining its calm, even timbre. "However, this specific window seat, 9A, was selected and purchased by me several months ago. Perhaps your assigned seats are in a different row?" Tiffany Sterling's perfectly glossed lips tightened into a bloodless line. "No. This is the row, and my son needs the window. It's a medical necessity. You wouldn't want to be responsible for a child having a panic attack, would you?" The manipulative framing of the question, the casual weaponization of a medical condition, sent a small, cold spike of anger through Eleanor's scholarly composure. She had spent a career studying the subtle and overt ways power was asserted, the language used to justify entitlement. This was a masterclass. "Mom, just make her move," Chad whined, finally looking up from his phone. "I want to post the takeoff for my followers." Eleanor's gaze shifted from the mother's condescending smile to the son's petulant scowl. She recognized the syndrome immediately, a terminal case of affluenza passed down from one generation to the next. "I am sorry if your son is feeling anxious," Eleanor said, a hint of steel now entering her tone. "But this is our seat. We paid for this specific seat for a very specific reason, and my granddaughter is quite happy where she is." Maya, sensing the rising tension, had pulled away from the window. The world outside had vanished, replaced by the looming conflict in the aisle. She looked at Eleanor, her wide, intelligent eyes filled with a question and a flicker of fear. Tiffany Sterling let out a sound that was halfway between a sigh and a scoff. "It's a seat. She's a child. She can sit on the aisle. It's really not that complicated. It would be so much simpler for everyone if you would just be reasonable and cooperate. We don't want to delay the whole flight over something so trivial, do we?" The phrase, "be reasonable," was, in Eleanor's experience, almost always deployed by someone being profoundly unreasonable. It was a verbal tool to reframe their own selfishness as the sensible default, and her refusal as a form of stubborn hysteria. "The difference," Eleanor said, her voice now quiet and dangerously precise, "is that this seat belongs to my granddaughter. She is occupying the seat I paid for. We will be remaining here. I am certain a flight attendant can assist you in finding your actual assigned seats." With that, Eleanor turned her attention back to Maya, a clear and deliberate act of dismissal. In the academic world, it was a signal that the debate was over. Here, in the narrow fuselage of Flight 822, it was merely the ringing of the bell for round 2. Tiffany's face flushed, a splotchy, unattractive pink that clashed with her linen suit. She was unaccustomed to being denied anything. Her voice, no longer syrupy, rose to a piercing frequency designed to attract attention. "Flight attendant. Excuse me. Flight attendant. I need some assistance here. This woman is refusing to move from our seat." Heads turned. The ambient chatter of boarding passengers subsided. A flight attendant with a frazzled expression and a name tag that read Brenda hustled over, her face already set in a mask of weary resolution. "What seems to be the trouble, ma'am?" she asked, her focus directed entirely at the well-dressed, loudly complaining woman. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Brenda hadn't made eye contact with her or Maya. She hadn't asked a neutral, fact-finding question. She had already identified the source of the problem, and it wasn't the woman shouting in the aisle. The institutional lines were being drawn, and the airline's representative had, without a single piece of evidence, already chosen her side. The storm that had been gathering in the terminal was about to make landfall in row 9. Brenda, the flight attendant, had the perpetually strained air of someone running on caffeine, cortisol, and a deep-seated resentment for the general public. She listened to Tiffany Sterling's account with a series of sympathetic nods, her expression a well-rehearsed pantomime of concern. "And I explained very politely," Tiffany embellished, placing a dramatic hand on her chest, "that my son has diagnosed flight anxiety and absolutely requires a window to manage his condition. We are Summit Tier members, for heaven's sake. We have certain expectations." "This woman," she gestured vaguely towards Eleanor, as if indicating a piece of lost luggage, "is being incredibly difficult and making a scene." Eleanor remained silent, a tactic she'd learned from years of chairing contentious faculty meetings. Let the accuser exhaust themselves on the absurdity of their own narrative. She was sitting calmly in her assigned seat. Tiffany was the one causing a disturbance. But when Brenda finally turned her gaze to Eleanor, her eyes held no curiosity, only a weary plea for compliance. "Ma'am," Brenda began, her voice a strained alloy of forced cheerfulness and impatience. "We really do need to close the doors and get this flight out on time. For the sake of an orderly departure, would it be possible for the little girl to just swap to the aisle? It's only one seat over. We can't hold up 200 other passengers." The framing was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It positioned Eleanor as the sole impediment to progress, the selfish obstructionist. It completely disregarded the facts of the situation, that they were in the seats they had paid for, and the Sterlings were not. "With all due respect," Eleanor replied, her voice low and firm, her enunciation crystalline. "That is not a solution. That is a concession. We selected and paid a premium for seat 9A for a specific reason. My granddaughter is settled. I see no logical reason why we should be the ones to accommodate passengers who are in the wrong seats." She met Brenda's gaze. "Could you please ask to see Mrs. Sterling's boarding passes and help her find her correct seats? That seems to be the most efficient way to resolve this." Brenda's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of annoyance. This was not the quick, submissive fold she had anticipated. Her eyes flickered between Tiffany's imperious glare and Eleanor's calm, unyielding expression. The internal calculus was depressingly transparent. On one side, a loud, expensively dressed, high-status frequent flyer who would undoubtedly file a 5-page complaint full of righteous indignation. On the other, a quiet, elderly black woman with a child. In the cynical arithmetic of corporate conflict avoidance, Eleanor and Maya were the path of least resistance. "Mum, I understand, but sometimes the system has duplicates," Brenda fabricated, her tone becoming patronizing. "The simplest way to fix this right now, so we can all get on our way, is just to make the little switch. We can't have a debate about it in the aisle." Maya, who had been trying to make herself invisible, leaned over and whispered, "Grandma El, it's okay. I can move. It's okay." Her voice was a tiny, heart-breaking tremor of surrender. That whisper, that child's instinct to appease, to shrink herself to make a conflict disappear, was what finally extinguished the last embers of Eleanor's academic detachment and ignited a cold, protective fury in her soul. This was no longer about an airplane seat. It was about a lesson. It was about teaching Maya that she had an inalienable right to occupy the space that was rightfully hers, that her comfort and her joy were not trivial things to be bartered away for the convenience of bullies. "No, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Maya's arm. She then looked back at Brenda, her resolve hardening like cooled steel. "There is no system duplication. I have the email confirmation, the seat assignment, and the receipt for the additional fee right here on my phone. The issue is that this passenger is demanding something that does not belong to her. As an employee of this airline, your duty is to enforce the rules of carriage, not to ask passengers who are following the rules to capitulate to those who are breaking them." The directness of the challenge, the calm recitation of facts, left Brenda flustered. Her corporate composure began to crack. "Ma'am, I am trying to de-escalate the situation. This situation was created by one person and is being escalated by you," Eleanor corrected, her voice still level. "Asking us to move is not de-escalation. It is enabling." Tiffany, sensing she was losing the upper hand, interjected loudly. "This is insane. I have never been treated with such disrespect. Are you going to do your job or not?" The pressure cooker was hissing. Other passengers were now openly gawking. A man in the row behind them muttered, "Oh, for crying out loud, just move the kid so we can take off." Another passenger across the aisle, a young woman, was discreetly filming the exchange on her phone. Brenda's face was now pale with a mixture of stress and anger. She saw the phone and knew this had the potential to become a social media nightmare. She made a choice. She leaned in closer to Eleanor, her voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "Ma'am, I am now giving you a flight crew instruction. To ensure the timely and safe departure of this aircraft, I need you to switch seats with the other passenger. If you refuse to comply with a flight crew instruction, I will be forced to call the purser and the captain. We can have you removed from this flight for non-compliance." It was the nuclear option, a breathtakingly dishonest perversion of FAA regulations which were designed to prevent safety threats, not to adjudicate seating squabbles. Eleanor knew it was a bluff, a gross abuse of authority, but it was a powerful one. The threat was unmistakable. Surrender, or we will publicly humiliate you and your 10-year-old granddaughter, offload your luggage, and leave you stranded in this terminal. Eleanor looked at Maya. The little girl's eyes were wide with a fear that tore at her grandmother's heart. The joy of the trip had completely curdled, replaced by a terrifying adult conflict she couldn't fully grasp, but knew was centered on her. She saw the impatient, staring faces of the other passengers. She heard the man grumbling. She saw the triumphant malice in Tiffany Sterling's eyes and the brittle, desperate authority in the flight attendants. In that moment, Eleanor's strategic calculation shifted. The battle for the seat was lost. To win it now would require an explosion, a refusal that would escalate the situation to a level that would deeply traumatize Maya. and Eleanor's primary directive, always, was to protect her granddaughter, to shield her from the world's casual cruelties. Right now, that meant de-escalating the trauma, not the argument. The fight for justice could be waged later on a different battlefield. But the fight for Maya's sense of security had to be won now. A cold, deliberate calm settled over Eleanor. She would comply. But she would not forget. She would not forgive. This was no longer a disagreement. It was an incident. And an incident, as any historian knows, demands to be recorded. "Very well," Eleanor said, her voice stripped of all warmth. "We will move." Brenda's shoulders slumped in relief. Tiffany Sterling's lips curled into a smug, victorious smirk. "See?" Tiffany said to the air around her. "Was that so difficult? A little bit of common sense is all it takes." Eleanor ignored her completely, her focus entirely on Maya. She forced her own face into a mask of serene calm, a placid surface to hide the inferno beneath. "All right, my love, let's play a little game of musical chairs. You come sit here on the aisle with me." Maya's lower lip trembled, but she nodded, unbuckling her seatbelt. As she slid out of 9A, Chad pushed past her without a word of thanks, flinging himself into the window seat. He immediately put his back to the aisle, pressing his phone against the window to film the view, utterly indifferent to the small, displaced girl now standing in the aisle. As Maya buckled herself into 9B, the aisle seat, she leaned into her grandmother. Her voice was so quiet, Eleanor had to strain to hear it over the renewed cabin announcements. "Grandma L." "Yes, my love." "Why did they make me move? Was it because I'm black?" The question, so innocent and so profoundly perceptive, struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. It was the question she had been dreading, the poison of the world seeping into her granddaughter's heart. She wrapped her arm around Maya's trembling shoulders, pulling her close. She had shielded her from the scene, but she could not shield her from its meaning. "No, baby," she lied, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "It's because some people are rude and impatient. It has nothing to do with you. You are perfect just as you are." But as she looked past Maya at Tiffany Sterling's triumphant profile and the retreating back of Brenda, she knew her granddaughter's question was far closer to the truth than her own comforting falsehood. The cold fury within her began to crystallize, no longer a raging fire, but a diamond-hard point of purpose. The plane hadn't even left the gate, but for Brenda, Tiffany Sterling, and Apex Air, the final, turbulent descent had already begun. The aircraft pushed back, taxied, and ascended into the hazy California sky. Below, the sprawling geometry of Los Angeles dissolved into the blue expanse of the Pacific. But Maya saw none of it. She sat huddled in the aisle seat, the book on aircraft design lying closed in her lap. The light in her eyes had been extinguished. Eleanor's heart ached with a palpable, physical pain. She tried to engage Maya, pointing out the drink cart, offering her a snack from her bag, but Maya's responses were monosyllabic and listless. The vibrant, curious girl who had been explaining the physics of a GE90 engine just 30 minutes ago had been replaced by a quiet, wounded shadow. In seat 9A, Chad was a constant source of low-grade irritation, loudly narrating his takeoff video for his mother, and occasionally jabbing an elbow into Maya's side as he shifted for a better angle. Tiffany, for her part, was absorbed in a glossy magazine, radiating an aura of untouchable self-satisfaction. To her, the matter was settled. She had gotten what she wanted. For Eleanor, it was just beginning. Her mind, trained for decades to sift through evidence, to analyze sources, and to construct a meticulous, fact-based narrative, was now fully engaged. Emotion was the engine, but methodology would be her map. She was no longer just a grandmother on a trip. She was a primary source, a witness, a historian documenting an event in real time. She discreetly took out her journal and her fountain pen. Under the heading Apex Air, Flight 822, LAX-C, she began to write. She noted the time. She described Tiffany and Chad Sterling, their appearance, their words, the exact phrases. She documented Brenda's response, her fabricated story of a system duplicate, her biased approach, and most importantly, her whispered threat of removal from the flight. She wrote with a calm, scholarly precision, her elegant cursive filling the page. This was not a diary of her feelings. It was a deposition. An hour into the flight, Brenda came by with the beverage service. When she reached their row, her demeanor was one of bright, brittle professionalism, a clear attempt to pretend the earlier confrontation had never happened. "And what can I get for you two?" she asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I will have a black coffee, please," Eleanor said, her voice neutral. "Maya?" "Nothing, thank you," Maya mumbled, not looking up. "Oh, nonsense," Tiffany Sterling chimed in from across Chad, not bothering to look away from her magazine. "Kids love ginger ale. Get her a ginger ale." Eleanor's gaze snapped from Tiffany to Brenda. "She said she doesn't want anything. My granddaughter is more than capable of ordering for herself." Brenda, caught in the middle again, looked flustered. She quickly poured Eleanor's coffee and pushed the cart along, eager to escape the tense gravitational pull of row 9. The interaction, though minor, was another piece of data for Eleanor's journal. The dismissal, the assumption, the complete erasure of Maya as an individual with her own voice. Eleanor sipped her coffee and waited. She needed to speak to someone in authority. But not yet. A direct confrontation now would be unproductive. She needed the right moment, a time when the crew was less harried and she could have a formal, uninterrupted exchange. She observed Brenda speaking with an older, more senior-looking male flight attendant near the forward galley. He wore a different-colored tie and carried himself with an air of weary authority. The purser, she surmised. From a distance, she could make out his name tag, Gary. She waited another 45 minutes until the beverage service was complete and the cabin had settled into the monotonous drone of mid-flight. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "I'll be right back, my love," she whispered to Maya, who simply nodded. Eleanor walked steadily to the forward galley. Brenda and Gary were there, restocking carts and chatting in low tones. Brenda's eyes widened in alarm as she saw Eleanor approach. Gary stepped forward, his expression professionally non-committal. "Can I help you, ma'am?" He had clearly been briefed. "Yes, I believe you can," Eleanor said calmly. She was not there to argue or to vent. She was there to gather intelligence. "I need to register a formal complaint regarding the conduct of a member of your crew during boarding. For the purposes of that complaint, I will require the full name and employee identification number of the flight attendant who handled the seating issue in row 9. She looked directly at Brenda. Brenda went pale. This was not a passenger who was going to write a vaguely angry email and then forget about it. This was something far more deliberate. Gary adopted the role of a managerial buffer. "Ma'am, company policy is for you to file a complaint through our customer service portal after the flight. I can give you the website." "I am aware of the procedure," Eleanor replied, her voice unwavering. "And when I file that report, it needs to be specific. So I will ask you again. I require her name and employee number, and yours as well, as you are the purser in charge." Gary's professional mask tightened. This was highly irregular. Passengers got angry, they yelled. They did not, as a rule, calmly demand employee numbers as if they were collecting evidence for a tribunal. "My name is Gary Prescott," he said stiffly, "and this is Brenda Miller. We are not authorized to give out our employee numbers." "I see," Eleanor said. She pulled her journal and pen from her jacket pocket. She calmly wrote down their names. "Then I will note in my report that purser Gary Prescott and flight attendant Brenda Miller refuse to provide their employee identification when requested in relation to a formal complaint of passenger mistreatment and abuse of authority." "Is that the official position you would like me to record?" The word record had a chilling effect. This was no longer a verbal dispute. This was documentation. This was evidence. Gary and Brenda exchanged a panicked look. Their training was about writing reports on unruly passengers, not about becoming the subjects of a meticulously documented complaint by a passenger who spoke like a lawyer. Gary sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. This flight was spiraling into a bureaucratic nightmare. He recited his employee number, and a reluctant Brenda did the same. Eleanor wrote them down with painstaking precision. "Thank you," she said. "Now for the record, I would like to state formally that my 10-year-old granddaughter and I were coerced and intimidated by Miss Miller into relinquishing our pre-selected, premium-paid seats, under the explicit threat of being removed from the aircraft for non-compliance." "Now hold on," Brenda interjected, her voice rising in panic. "I never threatened you." "You told me that if I didn't comply with a flight crew instruction to move, you would have me removed. That is the definition of a threat," Eleanor stated, her voice as flat and steady as a printed page. "It was a gross misapplication of your authority, used to settle a seating dispute that you failed to mediate with anything approaching impartiality." Gary held up a hand to silence Brenda. He tried a different strategy. Appeasement. "Ma'am." "Ms. Vance, is it?" he asked, glancing at a passenger manifest on a small screen in the galley. "Dr. Vance," Eleanor corrected quietly. "My apologies. Dr. Vance, I understand you're upset. On behalf of the crew, I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding. These seating issues can be very stressful. As a gesture of our goodwill, I would be happy to offer you and your granddaughter a credit for future travel on Apex Air." It was the standard corporate playbook, a small financial offering to make a large problem disappear. For most passengers, it would have been sufficient. "Mr. Prescott, I am not interested in travel credits," she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "An offer to fly again on an airline that permits its staff to bully a child is not a gesture of goodwill. It is an insult. What I am interested in is accountability. I want to ensure that what happened to my granddaughter today is not something that will ever happen to another child on any of your flights, ever again." The finality in her tone brooked no further negotiation. Gary was out of his depth. He was equipped to handle anger, not this cold, methodical purpose. It was unnerving. I will certainly file a full report of this conversation, Dr. Vance," he stammered. "I will need your full name and the name of your granddaughter for the report." "Of course," Eleanor said. She watched him, her gaze sharp and focused. This was the moment. The key turning in the lock. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Vance." She paused, letting the name and title settle in the small space. Then she delivered the payload. "And my granddaughter, the child who was forced out of her seat, is Maya." She let the silence stretch for a single, deliberate beat, ensuring she had their full, undivided attention. "Her last name is Thorne." Thorne. The name didn't just land in the small galley, it detonated. It was a name that everyone who worked for Apex Air knew. It was not the name of the current, faceless CEO or some anonymous private equity firm. that now held a controlling interest. It was a name from the company's very DNA. It was on the plaque in the lobby of their corporate headquarters in Seattle. It was the name of the brilliant, eccentric, and now famously reclusive founder who had started the airline 50 years ago with 2 leased planes and a revolutionary idea about customer service. Marcus Thorne. Gary Prescott's face, which had been a mask of professional concern, simply collapsed. The blood drained from it, leaving a sickly, greyish pallor. His mouth hung slightly open, as if he'd been unplugged. Brenda Miller's reaction was even more visceral. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, and her hand flew to her mouth, as if to physically stifle a scream. Her eyes, wide with a terror so pure it was almost sublime, darted from Eleanor's impassive face to the passenger manifest on the screen, desperately seeking a digital reprieve that would not come. But there it would be, in stark, corporate font. M. Thorne. The full, horrifying weight of their actions crashed down upon them. They hadn't just mishandled a customer complaint. They hadn't just sided with an entitled bully over a quiet family. They had, through a catastrophic combination of prejudice, poor judgment, and a callous abuse of their authority, actively mistreated, distressed, and humiliated the granddaughter of the man who had created the very airline that employed them. The living legend. The soul of the company. Thorne? Gary finally whispered, the name cracking in his throat. As in, Marcus Thorne. Eleanor didn't need to reply. Her calm, steady silence was a more powerful confirmation that any word could be. She simply stood there, an archivist of their ruin, letting the gravity of their mistake crush them. The quiet, elderly woman they had dismissed, patronized, and tried to buy off with a travel voucher was suddenly transformed in their eyes. She was no longer a difficult passenger. She was an emissary from the company's creator, a direct line to the man who held their careers, their mortgages, their entire professional lives in the palm of his hand. Brenda began to stammer, words tumbling over each other in a frantic, pathetic cascade. Oh my God, I had no idea. Dr. Vance, I swear, if I had known, I am so sorry. It was just, that other woman was so insistent, and we were behind schedule, and I just... Her apology was a confession, a transparent admission of the very prejudice Eleanor was fighting against, that a passenger's identity, their name, their status, was the sole determinant of the respect they were afforded. Eleanor cut her off with a single, sharp look. So, if her name had been Maya Smith, your conduct would have been acceptable? The question hung in the air, a final, brutal indictment from which there was no escape. Brenda wilted, her face crumbling in shame and fear. Gary, recovering slightly from the initial shock, lurched into a new mode, frantic, desperate damage control. Dr. Vance, please, let us fix this, right now. We will move Mrs. Sterling. We'll put her in the last row, by the lavatories. We can move you and Maya to first class. There are 2 empty seats. We'll bring you champagne, anything you want. Please allow us to correct our mistake. His voice was a desperate plea. He wasn't trying to solve a customer service problem anymore. He was trying to save his and Brenda's jobs. Move us to first class? Eleanor repeated, her voice dangerously soft. So, the solution to my granddaughter being publicly shamed and forced from her economy class seat is for her to be publicly moved again, this time like a prize poodle being upgraded. You believe the antidote to this humiliation is a wider seat and a complimentary glass of cheap champagne? She shook her head slowly. No, Mr. Prescott. The time for fixing it on this aircraft passed the moment Ms. Miller threatened me. We will be remaining in seats 9B and 9C for the duration of this flight. Her refusal was more terrifying to them than any shouting match could ever have been. By refusing their panicked offerings, she was refusing them absolution. She was ensuring that this incident would not be smoothed over at 35,000 feet. It would be dealt with on the ground by forces they could only imagine with a sickening, gut-wrenching dread. I have to inform the captain," Gary mumbled, his mind racing. He needed to escalate this to the highest possible authority on the aircraft. He practically fled the galley, scrambling towards the cockpit door like a man escaping a burning building. Brenda was left alone with Eleanor. She looked utterly broken, tears welling in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dr. Vance, I have 2 kids. I have a mortgage. I made a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake. Please don't let this ruin my life." Eleanor looked at the woman, at her genuine, gut-wrenching terror, and felt a flicker of something. It was not pity. It was a profound, academic sadness. This was the end result of 1,000 small compromises, of a system that encouraged corner-cutting and prioritizing the loud over the meek. Brenda wasn't an evil monster. She was a person who, when faced with a choice between what was right and what was easy, had chosen easy, and had done so at the expense of a child. "You should have thought of your children when you were threatening to remove a 10-year-old from a flight," Eleanor said, her voice as cold as the stratosphere outside the window. "You should have thought of your mortgage when you decided the comfort of an entitled bully was more important than the dignity of a little girl. Your life, Ms. Miller, is not my concern. My granddaughter's well-being is." With that, Eleanor turned and walked back to her seat, leaving Brenda alone in the galley, her face buried in her hands, the single, devastating word echoing in the small, silent space. Thorn. When Eleanor returned to row 9, Maya looked up, her expression filled with anxiety. "Is everything okay, Grandma L?" Eleanor managed a reassuring smile, the first genuine one in over an hour. "Everything is going to be just fine, my love." She sat down, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly beginning to ebb, replaced by a deep, bone-weary sadness that this had been necessary at all. Inside the cockpit, a frantic Gary Prescott was stammering out a condensed, terrified version of events to Captain Alistair Finch. Finch, a veteran pilot in his late 50s, with a calm demeanor forged by decades of handling everything from engine failures to medical emergencies, listened in stunned silence. He'd seen a lot in his 30 years of flying, but he had never seen a self-inflicted wound of this magnitude. "Let me be absolutely clear, Gary," Captain Finch said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief over the cockpit's hum. "Your flight attendant allowed a fare-paying passenger, a child, to be bullied out of her prepaid seat by another passenger, and then threatened the child's guardian with removal. And the child in question is Marcus Thorne's granddaughter?" "I wasn't there for the initial incident, Captain," Gary said defensively. "Brenda was handling it. By the time I was involved." "You were involved the moment it happened on your watch, as purser," Finch cut him off, his voice sharp. He rubbed his temples, a deep frown creasing his forehead. This was a 5-alarm corporate fire. He knew of Marcus Thorne not just by reputation, but had met him once, years ago. A brilliant, demanding man who valued 2 things above all else: elegant engineering and unwavering integrity. And he was fiercely, almost obsessively, protective of his family, especially his only grandchild. "All right," Finch said, his decision-making process kicking in. "This is what you are going to do. You are going to go back there, and you are going to apologize to Dr. Vance and the girl. Not a corporate apology, a real one. You will offer them anything they want. You will then instruct Brenda to work the rear galley for the remainder of this flight. She is not to go within 5 rows of them again. Is that understood?" Gary nodded, relieved to have a direct order, and scurried out of the cockpit. A few minutes later, he reappeared at row 9. His entire bearing had changed. He was no longer a manager. He was a penitent. He knelt in the aisle, a gesture of supplication so dramatic it drew stares, bringing himself down to eye level with Eleanor and Maya. "Dr. Vance," he began, his voice thick with a contrition that was only slightly undermined by his sheer terror. "On behalf of Captain Finch and the entire crew of Apex Air Flight 822, I wish to offer our most profound and sincere apologies for what occurred during boarding. It was inexcusable. There is no defense for it." He then turned to Maya, his voice softening. "And Maya, I am so very sorry that we allowed you to be treated that way and made you feel uncomfortable. That was our failure, and we are deeply ashamed." Maya, startled by the kneeling man and his sudden, intense apology, just stared at him before looking to her grandmother for a cue. Tiffany Sterling, who had been observing this bizarre turn of events with a perplexed frown, finally spoke up. "What in the world is going on? Why are you apologizing to them?" Gary shot her a look of pure, unadulterated venom, a flash of rage at the woman who had lit the fuse on this career-destroying bomb. "Ma'am," he said, his voice so sharp it could have cut glass, "I would strongly advise you to remain silent for the duration of this flight." The utter lack of customer service deference in his tone was so shocking that even Tiffany was stunned into silence. She shrank back in her seat, a confused and angry scowl on her face. She couldn't comprehend the sudden, seismic shift in the cabin's power dynamics. Eleanor acknowledged Gary's apology with a single, curt nod. "Thank you for the apology, Mr. Prescott. Please extend my appreciation to the captain." She offered no absolution, no comforting, "It's okay." The remainder of the flight passed in a state of surreal tension. The crew gave row 9 a wide, respectful berth, their movements tentative and fearful. Other passengers, sensing the dramatic shift, whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the quiet, elderly woman and the little girl who now seemed to command the absolute, terrified deference of the entire crew. As the plane began its descent into the cloudy skies over Puget Sound, the seatbelt sign chimed on. Gary made his way back to row 9 one last time. "Dr. Vance," he said quietly, "Captain Finch has been in communication with our Seattle ground operations. There will be a reception party for you at the gate to personally address this situation." Eleanor just nodded. She knew. She looked at Maya, who was finally showing a flicker of her old self, her eyes wide with the anticipation of seeing her grandfather. "Look, my love," Eleanor said, pointing past Chad's head to the window. "You can see the islands." For the first time since the incident, Maya leaned forward to look. She saw the deep green of the San Juan Islands against the steel-grey water. A small, genuine smile finally returned to her face. It was a smile of arrival. But for Gary Prescott, Brenda Miller, and the smug woman in seat 9A, it was the smile of Judgment Day. The touchdown at SeaTac was smooth, a stark contrast to the turbulent atmosphere inside the cabin. As the plane taxied to the gate, Captain Finch's voice came over the intercom, but it was not the standard, cheerful welcome. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at the gate. For operational reasons, we ask that you please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Ground personnel will be boarding the aircraft before deplaning begins. We appreciate your patience." A confused murmur spread through the cabin. This was not standard procedure. Tiffany Sterling huffed with impatience, already gathering her expensive tote bag. Eleanor, however, knew precisely what operational reasons entailed. She placed a calming hand on Maya's arm. "Just a few more minutes, my love." The jet bridge docked with a heavy thud. The cabin door hissed open. But instead of the usual stream of weary travelers, 3 figures stepped onto the plane. They were all men in dark, conservative suits that spoke of corner offices and immense authority. The first was the airline's chief of West Coast operations. The second was the vice president of in-flight services, who had clearly been pulled from his dinner. The third man walked past them both. He was older, perhaps in his late 70s, with a shock of unruly white hair and eyes that, despite his age, were sharp and piercingly blue. He moved with a slight stoop, but with an unmistakable aura of command that seemed to quiet the very air around him. He wasn't wearing a corporate uniform, but a simple tweed jacket over a worn cashmere sweater. It was Marcus Thorne. Gary and a visibly trembling Brenda met them at the door, their faces ashen. Marcus Thorne barely glanced at them. His eyes, burning with a cold, controlled fire, scanned the cabin until they found row 9. He walked down the aisle, his steps slow but deliberate. The cabin fell utterly silent. Every passenger was now locked onto the unfolding drama. He stopped at their row. He ignored Tiffany Sterling, as if she were part of the upholstery. His gaze, filled with a fierce, grandfatherly love, was only for Maya. "Hey, Firefly," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that was completely at odds with the storm in his eyes. Maya's face broke into a smile of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. "Grandpa!" She unbuckled her belt and launched herself into his waiting arms as he bent down to catch her. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, a long, silent embrace that was both a greeting and an apology. This was his world, his reason, and these people had harmed her. He looked over Maya's head at Eleanor. His expression was a mixture of profound gratitude and shared outrage. "Eleanor, thank you. I got your text." Eleanor had sent him a simple, factual message, mid-flight. "Incident on Apex 812. Maya is safe but very upset. Was forced by crew to give up her seat. Details upon landing." "Of course, Marcus," she said quietly. He stood up, settling Maya gently on her feet, but keeping a protective hand on her shoulder. Only then did he turn. His gaze fell first upon Gary and Brenda, who seemed to visibly shrink under its weight. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with it the unmistakable weight of creation and destruction. "Mr. Prescott, Ms. Miller," he said, having already been briefed on their names. 50 years ago, I founded this airline on a single, simple principle, that flying should not be an ordeal, but an experience built on mutual respect. The respect we show our passengers is a reflection of the respect we have for ourselves. Today, you have fundamentally failed that principle. You did not respect a customer, a child. And in doing so, you have shown no respect for this uniform, for this company, or for yourselves. He paused. "Hand your employee IDs to Mr. Davison. Your employment with Apex Air is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." Brenda let out a small, choked sob. Gary simply closed his eyes, his face a mask of utter resignation. It was over. Then, Marcus Thorne's gaze shifted, landing squarely on Tiffany Sterling. The gears had finally clicked into place in her mind. The name, the arrival of the suits, the old man who was clearly the ultimate authority. Her face, which had been a canvas of smug confusion, was now a portrait of dawning horror. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice dangerously even. "I have been made aware of your conduct. I understand you are a Summit Tier member, that your family spends a great deal of money with my airline." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "Let me be perfectly clear. We don't want it. Apex Air is not a private club for the entitled. You bullied a child. You lied about a medical condition. You instigated a confrontation that has now cost 2 people their livelihoods." He gestured to the VP. "Mr. Jennings here will process a full refund for your tickets. He will also be revoking your summit tier status, and that of your husband, permanently. Furthermore, you and your immediate family are now placed on our no-fly list. You are banned from this airline. For life." Tiffany's jaw dropped. "You can't. I'll sue you. I'll go to the press." Marcus Thorne gave a dry, humorless smile. "Please do. I invite you to. Tell them your story. Tell them how you demanded a 10-year-old black girl give up her seat and then watched as my employees enforced your petty, discriminatory whims. Let's see how that plays out for you in the court of public opinion." He then looked down at Chad, who was staring at his mother's unraveling with wide, confused eyes. "And you, son," Marcus said, his voice softening just a fraction. "A window seat is a privilege, not a right. Kindness is more important than altitude. I hope one day you understand that." He turned his back on them, the matter concluded. "Eleanor, Maya," he said, his warm, familial tone returning. "Let's go home." As they walked toward the front of the plane, Marcus paused and addressed the stunned passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Marcus Thorne. I founded this airline. I want to apologize for this delay and for the disgraceful behavior you were forced to witness. This is not who we are. I promise you. We will be better." He then led his family off the plane, leaving behind a cabin filled with the wreckage of 2 careers, 1 lifetime travel ban, and a powerful, unforgettable lesson in accountability. The harsh fluorescent light of the airport was replaced by the soft, worn leather of an old Lincoln Town car waiting for them on the tarmac. The door closed, sealing them in a quiet, insulated world, far from the drama they had just escaped. Maya, emotionally and physically exhausted, quickly fell asleep, her head resting on Eleanor's lap, her small hand clutching her grandfather's. Marcus watched his granddaughter for a long moment, a complex storm of fury, love, and relief on his face. He finally looked at Eleanor, his voice low and heavy with a weariness that seemed to go beyond his years. "I can't thank you enough, Eleanor. Not just for looking after her, but for how you handled it. Your text, it was so precise. No hysteria, just facts. I was listening to the captain's report on the drive over. You were like a prosecuting attorney." "I was a historian, Marcus," Eleanor said, stroking Maya's hair. "My job is to document the truth. But she asked me, on the plane, she asked me if it was because she was black. That's the truth at the heart of this. That woman saw a little black girl and assumed she was an easy mark, someone who didn't belong. And your crew, they made the same calculus. They sided with the blonde woman in the expensive suit. The name Thorne shouldn't have been the magic word that changed everything." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "You're right. It shouldn't have. And that's the part that's eating me alive. Firing those 2, banning that woman. That's the easy part. That's just amputating the gangrenous limb. But what about the sickness in the body?" I stepped back from the day-to-day years ago. I let a board of accountants and marketing gurus take over. They see passengers as revenue units and employees as human resources. They've optimized the soul right out of this company. He leaned his head back against the seat, looking older than Eleanor had ever seen him. "This has exposed something rotten in the culture I built. A bias, a weakness, a willingness to take the path of least resistance, which always hurts the person with the least perceived power. Later that evening, after Maya was tucked into bed in her mother's old room, Marcus sat with Eleanor on the back deck of his sprawling, rustic home overlooking Puget Sound. He had been on the phone for hours, his voice not loud, but carrying a tone of cold, hard authority that Eleanor had not heard from him in years. "I've called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning," he said, finally setting his phone down. "I'm invoking my founder's rights and taking back operational control of in-flight services, effective immediately. We're grounding the entire LAX-based flight attendant roster for a week. Mandatory, top-to-bottom retraining. It's going to cost a fortune in cancellations, and the board will scream. I don't care." He looked at Eleanor, his blue eyes sharp in the twilight. "The training manual is being thrown out. We're starting over. The incident of Flight 8022 will be the first case study. I want you to help me design the new curriculum, Eleanor. Your expertise, your perspective as a historian of American culture and civil rights, I need it. We need it." It wasn't a solution born of a single dramatic act, but the beginning of a long, arduous process. He wasn't just cleaning house, he was trying to rebuild it from the foundation up. The next morning, Marcus didn't take Maya to a fancy brunch. He took her to the massive Apex Air maintenance hangar at Payne Field. Amidst the cavernous space filled with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the sight of half-disassembled jet engines, he led her to a small, lovingly restored twin-propeller plane in the corner. "This was the first one, Firefly," he said gently. "The Sarah. I named it after your mum, long before she was born. I designed her myself." He lifted Maya up onto the wing. "What happened yesterday was wrong. It was ugly, and it was unfair. And I am so sorry you had to experience it. But I want you to look at this plane. It's strong. It's built to fly through storms. You, my dear girl, are built of the same stuff. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small enough to stay on the ground." Maya ran her small hand over the cool aluminum skin of the plane, her eyes wide with wonder. The shadow that had clouded her face since the flight was gone, replaced by the bright, shining light of her passion, rekindled and reaffirmed. A month later, Eleanor received a bound copy of the new Apex Air Employee Handbook. It was titled The Apex Way, A Culture of Respect. The first chapter was a detailed, anonymized account of Flight 822. It wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding. It detailed the unconscious biases, the procedural shortcuts, and the human failures that led to the incident. And it ended with a simple, powerful question. Who do we want to be? The karma of Flight 822 hadn't just been swift and decisive, it had been transformative. It wasn't just about firing 2 people and banning another. It was about forcing an entire corporation to look in the mirror and confront the reflection it saw. And for a little girl who loved airplanes, it was a painful but powerful lesson that her true worth wasn't determined by a seat number, but by the strength, dignity, and love of the family who would always, always have her back.